The witness knew what they had seen. They had been present. They had observed. They were prepared to speak, and the Roman court, before accepting a single word of what they had to say, ordered them to be tortured first. Not the accused, the witness. This is not a story about cruelty for its own sake. This is a story about one of the most paradoxical legal principles in the ancient world, a principle that Rome applied with remarkable consistency, that was embedded in its most sophisticated legal texts, and that reveals something deeply uncomfortable about how Roman civilization understood the relationship between physical suffering, social status, and the production of truth. In Rome, the testimony of a slave was only legally valid if it had been extracted under torture, but that is only the beginning of the story. Because what Rome did with torture was more complex, more internally coherent, and more philosophically revealing than the simple cruelty it first appears to be. To understand it, you have to understand what Roman law believed about truth. Roman legal thinkers operated within a framework that divided human beings into distinct categories with fundamentally different relationships to honesty. A Roman citizen's testimony was backed by his honor, his dignitas, his standing in the social fabric, his reputation among his peers. A citizen who lied in court risked something real and devastating, the destruction of the social identity that made his life meaningful and his participation in Roman civic life possible. A slave had none of that. A slave in Roman legal theory was a person without honor, without standing, without a social identity that could be damaged by dishonesty. They could lie freely. They had no stake in truth, and therefore Roman legal thinkers argued their words, offered voluntarily, carried no reliable weight at all. But the body was different. Legal historian Paul du Plessis, in his work on Roman law and legal practice, has described how the Roman legal tradition developed an elaborate philosophical justification for testimonial torture that went far beyond simple coercion. The argument, developed across centuries of Roman legal writing, was that physical pain created a kind of biological compulsion toward truth that social incentives could not. A person under sufficient physical duress, Roman legal theory held, would eventually be unable to maintain a lie. The body would override the will, and what emerged would be, of necessity, honest. This is the part most people find hardest to accept, because the modern understanding of torture, confirmed by every serious study of coercive interrogation, is that it produces not truth but compliance. A person under torture says whatever they believe will make the pain stop, regardless of whether it is true. The Romans, at some level, knew this too. Classicist Dominic Berry, in his analysis of Roman legal rhetoric and the treatment of testimony, has documented extensive debates within Roman legal writing about the reliability of tortured testimony. Cicero, in his legal speeches, explicitly acknowledged that torture was an unreliable method of producing truth, that the strong could endure it and maintain their lies, while the weak would confess to anything simply to make it stop. And yet the system continued for centuries, because the function of testimonial torture in Roman law was never purely epistemic. It was never only about finding out what was true. It was about something more fundamental to the Roman social order, the production of a legally authenticated statement that the court could point to as having been produced through the correct procedure. A tortured slave's testimony was not trusted because it was true. It was trusted because it had been produced through the right process. The torture was the authentication mechanism. It was the Roman equivalent of a seal on a document, not proof of the content, but proof that the content had been obtained in the manner the law required. Historian Miriam Pucci Ben Zeev, in her comparative work on ancient legal systems, has argued that this distinction between truth and authenticated statement is one of the most important and most overlooked features of ancient legal practice. Modern legal systems are, at least theoretically, built around the pursuit of truth as the primary goal of legal procedure. Ancient systems were often built around the production of legally correct process, with truth as a secondary concern. The Romans were not naive enough to believe torture always produced truth. They were sophisticated enough to have built a system in which the process of obtaining testimony mattered more than the reliability of the testimony itself. This created some remarkable legal situations. A freeborn Roman citizen could not be tortured to produce testimony under most circumstances, because the torture of a citizen would be a violation of their dignitas that the law could not sanction. But a slave belonging to the accused could be tortured to testify against their owner. And here the Roman system produced one of its most uncomfortable features. A slave who testified under torture against their owner was simultaneously being used as evidence against that owner and being treated, in the moment of testimony, as something closer to a person whose words had legal weight. The torture gave the slave's words authority, but only in that moment, and only for that purpose. Afterward, they remained property. Legal historian Richard Bauman, in his work on crime and punishment in ancient Rome, has analyzed cases in which the tortured testimony of slaves became the decisive evidence in trials of powerful Romans. Cases where the words extracted from property became the instrument through which citizens were condemned. The owners of those slaves had built a system in which their property could be turned against them. And they had built it deliberately, because in a world where slaves had intimate access to the most private details of their owners' lives, the alternative, simply excluding slave testimony entirely, created an evidentiary gap that the powerful could exploit too easily. Torture of slave witnesses was, in this light, a compromise between two unacceptable alternatives. Either you trusted slave testimony without qualification, which Roman honor culture could not accept, or you excluded it entirely, which Roman legal culture could not afford. Torture was the middle path. It was the mechanism that transformed unreliable property into authenticated evidence at the cost of the body of the person providing it. Now ask yourself what this reveals. Every legal system develops mechanisms for deciding whose words can be trusted, under what conditions, and verified through what processes. Modern systems use oath-taking, cross-examination, corroboration requirements, and the threat of perjury charges. These mechanisms are different from torture, but they serve the same underlying function. They are the procedures through which a legal system converts a person's statement into something the court can accept as evidence. The Romans chose a mechanism that now appears monstrous, but the question they were trying to answer, how do we know when a statement can be trusted, is the same question every legal system in history has had to answer, and no legal system has answered it perfectly. The tortured witness gave Rome what Rome needed, a statement produced through the correct procedure. Whether it was true was in the end a secondary concern. That gap between correct procedure and actual truth is not a Roman problem. It is a legal system problem, and it has never been fully solved.